everybody. Blake Ryder here, Director of Hospitality Research at Lighthouse. And with me, as always, is Mr. Daniel Foreman. Daniel, how are you, buddy? Can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely, doing good. Yeah. My name is Daniel Foreman. I'm a commercial strategist here at Lighthouse. I am also the host of our Spotlight podcast, and I've got about a decade of revenue management experience. So everything that we talk about today, I'm going to kind of shed some light from that revenue manager's perspective, but very excited to be here, Blake.
Thank you. Yes, we have a treat today. This is the impact of uncertainty, how geopolitical dynamics are impacting the United States travel industry in 25 and beyond. This is obviously super relevant, super topical, front of mind for everybody in the industry and frankly out of the industry. So let's get to it, buddy, shall we?
Let's do this.
All right, quick kind of walkthrough of our agenda. First, we'll start off with kind of how we got here. We won't spend too much time on that one just because I feel like a lot of people watching this probably already know, but we'll kind of set the stage, if you will. Then we'll try to quantify the impact of international travel to the United States to try to just quantify it, magnify how much we actually are relying on it. We will specifically then zero in on the neighboring countries for the U.S., so Canada and Mexico, and how the general uncertainty has impacted them specifically. We will then look at macro effects on hotel pricing specifically for the U.S. as a whole. And then we'll zero in on more specific markets and try to understand which markets are more or less impacted, which markets are insulated, if you will, to the general uncertainty. And then we'll try to look ahead and look at the second half of the year, 2026, and try to make sense of it all. So packed agenda, let us do it. Daniel, why don't you kick us off? Talk us through kind of how we got here. What's going on here?
All right. So what is driving this uncertainty? We have basically honed in on 4 different factors that we think are driving a lot of pricing uncertainty and just general uncertainty in markets right now. So the first one would be tariffs and trade disputes. And it's not only the tariffs themselves, but it's kind of that confusion around the tariffs, right? Like a tariff will be announced and then rescinded and then announced and rescinded again. So there's a lot of question marks around exactly what's going on with tariffs and when all that is going to happen. And then also too, border controls and immigration policies. So if you've been watching the news, you know that there's a lot of uncertainty around that right now, and a lot of things that are basically just making international travelers pause before maybe making U.S. travel plans.
And I think one of the obvious major things that we're contending with as a nation right now is this America First rhetoric that is at least being portrayed outwardly, and that's just broadly had a bit of a shift or caused a shift in how we're perceived, I would say, globally on the global stage. And we find ourselves more or less in kind of unfamiliar territory where countries are putting their citizens on alert about traveling to the U.S. It's just not something that we're used to as a country. And all this is kind of channeling itself into economic uncertainty, and then economic uncertainty has that impact on travel decline. It's business travel goes down a little bit, leisure travel goes down. So it's kind of a bit of a perfect storm. So that's how we got here. Okay. So let's first dive into, because obviously a lot of this is impacting, the international business. So how important is international inbound travel to the U.S.? And what we kind of see here is, broadly speaking, Canadian and Mexican international inbound travel largely comprises about half, along with China as well. China is a small sliver, but a lot of those the tariffs are largely focused around China, so we included them here as well. But if you look at the total pool of international inbound travel to the U.S., a little more than half is what we are for Canada and Mexico at least. And if we were trying to quantify how important that travel is, how much are they spending? Well, broadly speaking, according to the U.S. Travel Association, total travel spend in the U.S. was about $1.3 trillion in 2024. So roundly, we're talking about 20% is that international segment. So certainly a substantial amount of it. And Daniel, kind of what do you see here? Talk to me about these international travelers.
Yeah, I mean, just to add a little bit of additional color to this too, think about international travelers who come to the US. That's a very, very lucrative traveler, right? Someone who's coming to the US from Europe or Asia, they're not staying for 1 or 2 nights, right? They're probably staying for 5 nights or 7 nights or 10 nights. So every international guest that we lose who comes to the US, it really hurts because that's somebody who spends a ton of money when they're in the US.
As that ripple effect. And just looking at where data was in the first quarter, Expedia's CFO announced that the company's bookings into the US fell 7% year over year in the first quarter. And specifically, Canadian travel booked through Expedia, bookings to the US from Canada were down nearly 30% year over year. So, I mean, the numbers are very real. And if we look at this is some Lighthouse search data. Okay, so what we have here is May data year over year. So May 2024 and May 2025. And specifically, this is outbound search data. So when a search originating from Canada is searching internationally, what's the percentage breakdown in terms of where it's actually going to? It's travel for what destination? Okay, so that's what we're looking at year over year for 24 and 25. And what we can see here is that if we look at the US, very significant drop, 9.3 percentage points down year over year in terms of those outbound searches originating from Canada. And then we look at this data and we can see just how the distribution of what the US lost, how the other nations gained. And we see the biggest gain is in France. And we can, that makes sense given the kind of the French-Canadian connection. And Mexico, obviously, 1.9 points up as well. So we see it, and then we have a bunch of different kind of smaller increases across other nations, fairly evenly distributed. But that's the international segment. Now we'll switch gears and we'll look at the domestic gains. Okay, so Daniel, kind of talk me through this chart, which is how the shift kind of happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, what we're looking at here, this is Canadian hotel search by country, right? So this is where Canadians are searching right now. And you can see it's pretty obvious there, right? Around January, February, and you can see Blake is toggling through here right now and kind of showing you some visuals of that search volume to the US starts to drop off, and it really starts to get noticeable right around the start of the year. Now, what's interesting is where that search volume is picking up. A lot of it is actually opting to stay domestic, right? So you've got that green bar that continues to grow and grow and grow from January, February, all the way to May. And then, Blake, do you want to maybe explain kind of what you just overlaid right there? Because I think that's really interesting too.
Absolutely. Yep. So like Daniel said, these red boxes, these are just basically the year over year equivalent of how much was lost. So what you see here is April right now, when that red box that you kind of see appearing, that's what April was up to last year and how much was lost. And then when we look at these kind of faded out bars, that is to scale how big the previous year equivalent month, so May to May, April to April, February to February, et cetera, what the amount of search demand that stayed domestic in Canada looked like. So those opaque bars on the top and the bottom that you see, those are the gains that the domestic Canadian travel has gained by offset by the loss of travel demand searching for the U.S. And this is Mexico. So Daniel, what do you see here? Because I look at this, there's not much loss here, really. It's pretty much the same for Mexico.
Yeah, Mexico is interesting. So it kind of goes opposite to what my expectations would have been. I would have expected Mexican travel to the US to drop a little bit more than this, but really it's just been kind of up and down for the past couple of years. So what I think is probably going on here is there is a more, I guess, organized boycott of US travel going on within Canada right now. And for Mexican travelers, I think it's really just kind of business as usual, right? So we've had some rhetoric with them that's been kind of ratcheted up for a long time now. So I think things are just like business as usual for Mexicans traveling to the US, whereas the Canadian traveler is a little bit more organized about their not wanting to come to the US, right? So I would say this isn't even really that noticeable of a drop off from 2024 to 2025. So yeah, business as usual here.
Right. Yeah. The impact to Canada, at least, is much more new in terms of what's going on.
Yeah.
And okay, I'm going to explain this one for a second. So we're going to zoom out for a second, and this is a truly macro chart. What we're looking at here, this is the data from price movements for May through year end. So there are 245 days from May through year end. And what we're looking at is advertised pricing for the 245 days from May to year end as of March and then as of April. So the change for those 245 days, how prices changed from March to April. Okay. And what we can see here is that each one of these orange lines that you see on your screen right now, that's one of the days. These are chronological. So May 1st all the way through December 31st, comparing March to April pricing. And what we could see is that not a single day had price increase from March to April. Prices came down across the board. The bigger, more extreme examples down about 5.2%, but the average decline was 2% down when just comparing March to April. That's not even a year-over-year thing. That is March to April, pricing came down quite markedly, okay? And then we look at the exact same chart, same explanation, 245 days comparing March to April, but this is for Canada. And I mean, this kind of drives it home, right? Because we saw the down shift in pricing for in the US, and we see the up shift in pricing for Canada, because now we know that the Canadians are staying domestic. Some are opting now for domestic travel. And listen, the Canadian hoteliers know that, and they're driving price, and they should. I mean, that's how revenue management works, Daniel, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, Canada is a huge country, right? So if you are a Canadian who is in Ontario and maybe last year you were thinking about going to California, well, maybe you cancel that and instead you just go to British Columbia instead, right? And keep your dollars in Canada. So I think that's what's going on here is there's just big surge in demand. For that reason.
Yeah. Okay. So I think this is the smoking gun. Okay. I'm going to take a second and really explain what we're looking at here. Okay. So this is summer pricing. We are looking now at summer pricing for June and July. Okay. In aggregate. And what we did here is we took summer travel pricing, June and July in aggregate for each 23 and 24. And we indexed those summer travel prices to January. So that's why you see January at 100%, because again, it is indexed to January. Aggregate summer pricing indexed to January. And what we see is that compared to January, February is up a little bit higher in each 23 and 24. So we're talking, 100.3, 100.4%, whatever, something like that. And then March closer to 101%, probably not quite, but we could see that again, relative to January, we see pricing increasing over the course of Q1 for summer travel. And then in April, it levels off a bit. It gets pretty close back to 100%. So more or less steady Eddie. And then May, it dips a little bit, dips to like 98-ish% roughly. And Daniel, just correct me if I'm wrong here, but that just summer's the following month. This is June and July. So it's just hotels kind of titrating their pricing to make sure they get maximum occupancy, right? And that's what we see?
Yeah. And this is like a totally normal pricing curve, right? So as you get a little bit of base occupancy, February and March, you push rate, and then you get closer to arrival, and then you make those kind of fine-tune adjustments to maximize your occupancy. So this is very much like a normal pricing curve for the past couple of years. Perfect. But then here's 2025 is coming.
Here's the smoking gun. Ready? Here's 25. Okay. This is summer travel pricing indexed to January for 25. And we could just see it's been losing ground every single month. So we wanted to have this chart here because honestly, some people might think that it's normal for pricing to just kind of come down from January onward, through Q1, but that's not. So that's kind of what we're dealing with currently. Okay. And then to really drive the point home, we have a series of kind of a little animation, if you will, that will kind of walk you guys through right now. And here it is. Okay. So this is second half of the year advertised pricing. Okay. So pricing for July through year end, just time series of pricing, advertised pricing. And this is advertised pricing for the US as a whole as of January. Okay? So this is as of January. This is as of February. This is as of March. Just keeps coming down. Advertised pricing as of April and advertised pricing as of May. So, Daniel, what do you see here, man?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a revenue manager, right? So I'll take any chance to be optimistic and price rates higher if I can. But this just kind of shows you that as the year is going on, we're not really seeing a ton of cause for optimism. So rates just continue to come down and come down and come down, which is, like we saw on the previous slide, is very much not normal for this time of year.
No, it's not. So. And here's the other thing. This is interesting. This is the power of search data. So with US pricing coming down, we're actually seeing a bit of an uptick in search demand for US travelers searching for hotels in the US. So looking back the last couple of years, in May 2023, US travelers were searching for US hotels for about 57% of searches. That was May 23. May 24, about 56% of searches, okay? This year it's up to 60%. So we're seeing an uptick in this. We're seeing an uptick in May pricing. Yes, there are specific markets that are driving the decline. I'm so happy that was brought up. We are actually going to be getting that into 2 slides. Thanks so much for the question. We'll be diving into those markets really soon. Super interesting. So, right now, actually. So, perfect segue. So, this is Washington, D.C., okay? So, this is the same chart that we looked at a few slides ago, with the only difference being this is D.C., the other one was the U.S. overall. And beyond that, this is organized. The other one was chronological. This is just by magnitude of the price movements. You can kind of see this is all magnitude, okay? So, D.C. has been affected much, much more significantly than the overall U.S., okay? The overall U.S., we were looking at an average of about 2% from March to April in terms of the price correction from March to April for the, again, May through year end. Here in D.C., 5.9% was the average decline. And of those 245 days, 240 had a negative drop. And if you look at the far right of that chart, you can see the small little increases for those 5 days. So, Daniel, why do we think this happened to DC much more markedly than it happened in the US?
Yeah, so DC is one of, if not the most affected markets for all of this. And what I think is going on is I think it does have to do with per diem travel, especially, right? Because there's been big cuts with all sorts of government travel. And typically hotels in DC, they can rely on pretty reliable occupancy base that comes from that per diem travel, right? So when that drops or even goes away, what those hoteliers have to do is now lower their bar rates to try to build some of that base occupancy back. So that is what I think is going on in DC, but it's obviously very exaggerated in that DC market.
Totally. And we'll now look at some other markets that have been more impacted. So what we did, we found the top 110 markets per 2023 data from the U.S. Department of Commerce, International Trade Administration, okay? This is per them, the top 110 markets for international overseas visitors, okay? These are the top 8 of that list of 110. So there's the top 8 markets, again, per the U.S. Department of Commerce, for international overseas visitor arrivals. And what we see here is 2 numbers for each of these destinations. The number of the blue number, that is the number of days that experienced negative price declines from March to April. So, for example, in Los Angeles, of the 245 days from May to year end, 244 days came down in pricing from March to April with an average decline of 4.1%. And we see DC, 240 days, average of 5.9%. So these are key gateway cities that have experienced, on average, 232 days of decline from March pricing compared to April pricing, with an average of 3.6. Daniel, what do you see here?
Yeah, so what this is telling me is for your gateway markets, and again, for those of us who may not know the lingo, right? Like a gateway market that's either going to be kind of that first city that an international traveler goes to, or that's going to be one of these major cities that an international traveler kind of builds their itinerary around, right, when they're here. So no surprises, the markets that you get in here: Los Angeles, Miami, Vegas. But what's going on here is I think that these markets that are really reliant on the international traveler, these are the ones that are getting hit the hardest right now.
Totally. This is the same list of 110 cities, okay? But this is the bottom 8. So to be clear, we're not saying these are the bottom 8 markets in the country for international travel, because obviously we could find markets where that's essentially 0. This is of that list of 110. This is the bottom 8, okay? So again, markets that do have some international travel, but not in the top echelon. And what we can see here, and this is fascinating, the numbers are not as impacted. They're impacted, no doubt. But if we look at the average, I mean, Daniel, kind of talk to me here. What do you see here about something positive even?
Okay, so here are markets that are actually doing okay, and they're experiencing some pricing growth. And the reason for this is these are markets that are just a lot less reliant on the international travel, right? What are some characteristics of these markets? Well, I would say that these are more domestic heavy. Also, too, they probably have, I would even call these maybe like secondary, tertiary markets. Some of these are kind of what I would call drive-to markets. So these are cities where people are either driving through or just staying for a shorter length of stay. But again, less reliant on the international travel.
And look at that, down 0.9, less than 1%, and down 167 days. So an order of magnitude better. Still not great, to be clear, but it just kind of goes to show when you're not as reliant on the international travel, that's kind of how you're impacted. And okay, this is interesting. Okay, so we're going to kind of walk through that same animation that we did a few slides back for the overall US, but for Sedona, Arizona. And we'll talk about in a second why we picked Sedona, because there's a reason. But what I want to do is kind of walk through this little animation of advertised pricing for Sedona, July through year end, as of January, then as of February, and so on, okay? So Sedona, Arizona, as of January. February is a bit of a mixed bag, kind of up, kind of down. It's, call it all awesome, like almost flat, a little bit up, a little bit down. But then here's March, up. Here's April, up even more. And here's May, and it's up even more. Now, here's why we picked Sedona. Sedona was one of the best performing markets over this kind of last several month time stretch in terms of their ability to drive pricing. So that's why we picked Sedona. Now, why do we think a market like Sedona was able to do this? Well, according to the 2023 annual survey conducted by Sedona, by the Sedona Chamber of Commerce, they reported that a staggering 82% of visitors arrived in Sedona by car, relative to 13% by airplane. So what does this tell us? Just like Daniel was talking about on the last section, this is a regional drive-to type market. It's not a destination that relies heavily on international tourism. And honestly, this kind of goes back to this, like, this is why it's so important to know the data and know your traveler. Because if whatever's happening in the world is happening, but you're Sedona and you just know where your visitors are coming from, and you know that your visitors aren't really relying on international business, you can operate business as usual, right? I mean, you don't have, if you know you're not relying on it. And here's the outcome. Daniel, talk to me here. What do we see?
All right. So the important takeaway here is for Sedona, the majority of dates, they are actually pushing rates for those stay dates. So most of the markets that we were looking at earlier, right, they had the vast majority of days were dropping in pricing. And, DC was the extreme example of that, right? They only had 5 days where we had that forward-looking pricing growth. But for Sedona, it's far more than half, right? Most of these dates on here have pricing growth, more than 2/3 even, it looks like.
Yeah. So, all right. So I bet everyone now wants to know, so where do we go from here? Great question. So this is kind of our outlook in terms of where we see potentially things going. And obviously, this is a very dynamic situation. It's changing constantly. But right now, we're going to kind of walk through where pricing was last year, where pricing is this year, and where pricing at the moment looks for next year. And we'll kind of talk about how we see this all materializing. So this is 2024 pricing by month. This is actualized pricing. Now this is 2025 pricing layered in. Now some of this is actualized and some of this is advertised. Daniel, kind of walk us through if you can, please.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So you just overlaid 2025 on here, right? So you can see that when we started the year this year, we actually did have a few months where we were seeing some modest pricing growth, right? So January, February, and it's really March where things kind of start to slip behind last year. And then it's really the summer, right? So it's that April through, I would say, August, even into September and October, where we're really down versus last year. So there is some kind of light at the end of the tunnel, I would call it. Starting in November and December, this is kind of where we start to see, I would say, somewhat of a return to normal. And then Blake just overlaid this as well into 2026. This is where it starts to look like business as usual as far as from a forward-looking pricing perspective. So January of 2026, we have good growth in advertised pricing. February, good growth. March. So there's some cause for optimism, but unfortunately, we're going to have to wait a little bit until at least probably November of this year.
Totally. Yeah, these are advertised prices, but for now, cautiously optimistic, right? I mean, at least it hasn't bled over to next year, at least not yet.
Exactly.
So key takeaways. So here is where we're at after all this. What are the key takeaways here? So international travel from Canada and Mexico, more significant impacts to Canadian demand versus Mexican demand. And I think, as you know, Daniel kind of put it, it's somewhat new territory in terms of this relationship right now, in terms of how Canadians are viewing travel to the U.S. Mexico, this is, it hasn't really been impacted that much. And also downward hotel pricing adjustments for the U.S. broadly. Okay, so overall, broadly coming down, but like Daniel just said, end of the year, November is where it kind of changes a little bit, almost flat. And then December has some rate appreciation. And then right now, as of right now, we're still seeing rate pop year over year in looking at advertised pricing for January, February, March, April, May, compared to actualized pricing for those months of this year.
Yep. And then the final two key takeaways here from today's presentation is that gateway cities are impacted more than those cities which are less reliant on international demand. So if you're in a market and you know that you do a ton of international travel, you're probably going to be a little bit more vulnerable to some of these, price drops and this lower advertised pricing that we're seeing. But if you are in a more insulated market where you've got more people driving through or driving to your destination and you're not as reliant on especially the international guest who's flying in, then again, you're going to be a little bit safer, a little bit more insulated. And then finally, 2026 pricing growth is showing some year-over-year growth, but we did put that little disclaimer on there for now, ... So we'll have to see where this goes, but as of right now, we are cautiously optimistic, at least from what we can see in that Q1 forward-looking pricing.
Totally. So all this is to say, uncertainty is impacting the current demand and pricing landscape, but the impact to medium term for now, no, that's right now. That's kind of the key takeaway. I see a lot of questions coming in. We're just about at time, but we will do our best to kind of get those answered in the chat as soon as we kind of hang up. And like Daniel said, we'll get these slides distributed to the attendees so you guys can have them for your own commercial strategy meetings. Great participation. Super happy to see all those comments coming in on the chat. And like I said, we'll do our best to get those all answered. Thank you as always for joining. Right now, really quick on the screen, if there's a way that Lighthouse can help you, there's going to be a survey that pops up. You just hit yes. And if you want to be contacted by someone from Lighthouse to discuss your own commercial strategy, you can do that. Or you can just sign off and hit no. No big deal either way. Thank you all for joining us. Till next one. The next one, by the way, is going to be in August. One of our most popular ones. It's going to be our read-through of the H1 pricing report, the live read-through. Always one of our most popular live events, so don't forget about that. Watch the socials for the date and the time. But for now, my name is Blake Ryder.
And I'm Daniel Foreman.
And we will see you guys next time on Lighthouse Live.